I want to cross live now to the former Australian ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma. He joins me from a vigil in Sydney's East. Thanks so much for joining us, Dave, on this emotional occasion. I wonder if you can tell me first up about that vigil in Sydney's East. Who was there and what was the tone of the service?
Well, look, there was a couple of thousand people here, and it was a really moving occasion of solidarity, mourning. People were obviously sad by the events that have happened, but, you know, glad to be in each other's company, glad to be able to comfort one another. And I must say, you know, the New South Wales Premier Chris Minns was there. He spoke well. The opposition leader, Peter Dutton, was there. He spoke well. Mark Butler, representing the Prime Minister, was there. They spoke well. It was an important occasion. And I said to someone here earlier, this is the Australia I know. There was no chanting of death to any particular group. There was no burning of flags. There was people together in a respectful way, commemorating a terrible tragedy that's happened overseas. And this is the sort of Australia I know. This is the sort of image we should be showing to the rest of the world.
Yeah,
the sort of things we saw at the Opera House on Monday night.
Exactly. Great to see bipartisan support there. The Prime Minister represented the state Labor government. And as you say, Peter Dutton, here's a little bit of what Peter Dutton had to say.
What we know of the Jewish people is their determination, their ability to never give in, to always stick together. And we will always stand with the people of Israel.
Now, I should point out that there would have been people at that vigil who knew the first Australian victim, Galit Carboni, a 66-year-old grandmother who has relatives in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. So a very, very poignant ceremony for them, of course. I want to go to the personal with you too, Dave, because I remember talking to you when you were ambassador in Israel, and you and your wife Rachel and your three daughters having to take shelter time and time again in your house because of rocket fire in from Gaza. So you've experienced some of that fear. Personally, how have you dealt with the atrocity you've seen through these reports from Israel now?
Look, I found it very upsetting, as of my wife Rachel and three girls, because we remember quite vividly the very small fraction of fear that we would have felt when we were there under these rocket attacks compared to what people in Israel have been going through, and particularly those people in places like towns around the south, Sderot, Be'eri, this terrible kibbutz where these awful crimes were committed and these awful terrorist acts were committed. I can only imagine the horror that those people have gone through and that they're still feeling. Tonight there was a woman I was speaking with who knows a family that 5 members of which have been abducted and taken into Gaza. You know, she doesn't know what's happened to them. She obviously fears the worst for them. This is the sort of terror and anxiety they're living with right now.
Now, Dave, I just want to point out to people that you're not Jewish. I know some people often assume that you are Jewish, but from your perspective as a foreign affairs operator, as a diplomat, as a politician, and in your travels around the world, can you explain this weakness, particularly from the left when it comes to Israel? Why is there so much ambivalence about showing support and empathy for Israel?
Well, they've got a huge blind spot there, or some sort of prejudice. I don't understand. They'll tolerate and they'll call out, and rightly so, all sorts of other forms of prejudice and racism and intolerance and whatnot. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to discrimination against the Jews, when it comes to denying the legitimacy of the State of Israel to exist, they're nowhere to be seen. But I think, you know, what they need to understand is it's like the Martin Niemöller quote from who was a political prisoner of the Germans in the Second World War, that it might start here, but if you don't stand up for Australian values on all these sorts of issues, you're pretty soon going to lose them. And maybe one day this mob is chanting death to the Jews, and the next time they're chanting death to the gays, or the next time they're chanting death to some other group. And pretty soon we'll lose the Australia that we've got if we don't stand up firmly against this sort of stuff, speak out strongly against it, condemn it unreservedly, and make sure we never see those sorts of scenes again.
Yeah, well said, Dave. Let me get you to put on your hat as a former diplomat and an international affairs analyst. What happens next in Israel? Do we see a ground invasion by the IDF into Gaza, which would be horribly bloody? And do we have to steel ourselves for the live streaming executions of hostages?
I don't really see another way that this one ends, Chris. I mean, Israel has tried to contain Hamas now for the better part of 15 to 20 years. They've gone in there periodically every few years to scale back their military capabilities to try and deter them. But I think what these weekend's events have shown, this horrible terrorist attacks have shown, is that that concept has failed. Hamas has not been deterred. In fact, they've been emboldened. And the only way that Israel can ever live in peace and security is the complete destruction of Hamas. And that only happens with a pretty fulsome operation, not just from the air, but also from the ground, to eliminate Hamas's military leadership, to destroy all their military infrastructure, and to ensure that they cannot regroup and take political power once again in Gaza.
Dave, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on.